My name is Anne. It was last Easter, and I found myself sitting at the dining table, the very one where my mother used to serve her delicious apple pie. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and I could sense that something was off. Suddenly, my step-brother, Jake, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You were never really part of this family. Ask your mother why." My mother had passed away 20 years ago, and his words hit me like a ton of bricks. My father dropped his fork, and the room fell into a deathly silence. There were 15 of us at the table, forks frozen in mid-air, and everyone holding their breath. Then, my grandmother, Mrs. Thompson, the quietest one at the table, 75 years old with a bad back and her old handbag on her lap, stood up. She reached into that well-worn bag she'd carried every day as long as I could remember, pulled out a yellowed envelope, and said, "I've waited 20 years to show you this. Let me take you back to a few weeks before that fateful Easter. I was in my apartment in Seattle, working on some interior design plans for a new project when my phone rang. It was my father. He doesn't call often, maybe once or twice a year, usually on my birthday if my stepmother, Lisa, reminds him. "And your stepmother and I want the whole family together for Easter this year," he said, his voice sounding flat, as if he was reading from a script. "Lisa says we need to talk about the future of the house," he continued. The house. It was the place where my mother, Emily, had planted roses every spring, read me stories in the cozy living room, and marked my height on the doorframe of my bedroom. I hadn't been back since Christmas when Lisa had seated me at the far end of the table, like an outsider. But when my father mentioned that my grandmother had asked about me, I agreed to go. "One more thing," he said, his tone hesitant. "Lisa says to bring some form of ID. She says it's for some paperwork." Paperwork at Easter dinner? It didn't make sense. But my father just said he didn't know and that Lisa had asked me to bring it. After hanging up, I sat there, looking at my design plans. I'm an interior designer, and I know when something's off balance. That phone call had all the signs of a problem waiting to happen. Let me tell you about the house. It's on a large lot at the end of Maple Street in a small town near Seattle. It's a beautiful old Victorian with a wraparound porch and white shutters that my grandfather, Mr. Thompson, painted when I was a baby. It was the kind of house where neighbors would stop and chat, and the smell of freshly baked cookies would fill the air. My mother loved that house more than anything. Every spring, she'd plant roses along the front walk. She had a little reading nook in the living room with a soft armchair that smelled like her favorite lavender perfume. And every few months, she'd stand me against the doorframe of my bedroom, press a pencil on top of my head, and draw a small line, adding a heart beside it. "That's how much you've grown," she'd say with a big smile. She died when I was 10. Breast cancer, diagnosed too late. She was always so full of life, and it was hard to believe she was gone. After she passed, my father was a mess. He couldn't cook, he forgot to pick me up from school sometimes, and he'd just sit on the porch, looking at the roses and crying. About a year later, Lisa came into our lives. She was a friend of a friend from my father's work. She brought casseroles and helped organize the house. She told my father he didn't have to do everything alone. Within a few months, she moved in, and within a year, they were married. She brought Jake, her 6-year-old son, with her. Slowly, the traces of my mother started to disappear. The pictures of my parents' wedding came off the wall, the lavender perfume smell faded from the living room, and the roses were replaced with a small garden of artificial flowers. But the pencil marks on the doorframe of my bedroom stayed, because Lisa never noticed them. On Easter Sunday, I drove 3 hours from Seattle to the small town. I had prepared what I'd say if the conversation about the house turned bad. I had a polite version, a firm version, and a more aggressive one. I was hoping for the best but ready for the worst. As I pulled into the driveway, I counted the cars. Jake's new sports car, Lisa's SUV, and my grandmother's old sedan parked a bit crookedly. There were also a few other cars I didn't recognize. Lisa had invited a lot of people. I thought she wanted an audience, and I was right. Lisa met me at the door with a big, fake smile and a hug that felt more like a performance. "And, it's been so long. We've missed you," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the living room to hear. Jake was on the couch, playing on his phone. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I scanned the dining room. The long table was set for 15, with Lisa's fancy china and a vase of Easter lilies in the middle. Next to Lisa's seat, there was a thick folder full of papers. My grandmother was sitting in a chair by the window, her handbag on her lap. She reached out and grabbed my hand as I passed. "Sit beside me tonight," she said softly. From the kitchen, I heard Lisa say to my father, "You remember what you need to say, right?" My father just nodded. When everyone was seated, Lisa started steering the small talk. "Jake has some exciting news," she said, putting her hand on his shoulder. Jake leaned back and grinned. "I've been offered a great business opportunity. Can't say too much yet, but it's going to be huge." I ate my dinner in silence. My father sat at the head of the table, looking at his plate as if it held all the answers. He hadn't even glanced at me since I arrived. About 20 minutes into the meal, I saw Jake lean over to Lisa and mouth, "When? And then now?" Lisa patted his hand, and then my father pushed his chair back and stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon, and the conversation stopped. "I want to say something important," he began, his voice cracking. Lisa opened the folder beside her and slid a stack of papers towards him. My father glanced at the top page and then at Lisa. She gave him a small nod. "Lisa and I have been discussing the future of the house. We've decided to transfer the ownership to Jake," he said quickly, as if ripping off a Band-Aid, and then sat down. The room went silent. I looked at the papers. From where I was sitting, I could see the letterhead. It was a real estate development company, Evergreen Developments. My hands went cold. They weren't keeping the house, they were selling it. The porch where my mother and I used to sit, the rose garden, and the doorframe with my height marks were all going to be bulldozed. I kept my voice calm. "That house is where my mother lived and died." "I don't agree with this," I said. Jake tilted his head and said, "Oh, come on, Anne. You were never really part of this family." He spread his hands wide, trying to get the others on his side. "Ask your mother why." I took a deep breath. "My mother has been dead for 20 years, I said. "Exactly," Jake said, his smile not wavering. "So you can't ask her. But everyone here has heard the rumors." I looked at my father. His face was pale, and he dropped his fork. He stared at the tablecloth and didn't say a word. Lisa sat there, looking calm, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, as if she was waiting for this moment. Then, my grandmother stood up. She opened her handbag and pulled out the yellowed envelope. "I've waited 20 years for this moment," she said. "In 2002, a year after your mother died, your father started hearing rumors that you might not be his biological daughter. I took you to our family doctor and arranged a paternity test. You were 11 at the time, and you thought we were just going for a check-up." She unfolded a lab report and held it up. "The probability of paternity is 99%. And is your biological daughter, and she always has been." Jake tried to brush it off. "That's old. It doesn't count." "But my aunt, who's a lawyer, said, DNA doesn't have an expiration date, Jake." My father looked at the report, his eyes red. I asked him, "Did you know? Or did you just suspect?" He stammered, "I didn't know who to believe." I said, "But you chose who to believe, right?" He didn't answer. My mother's best friend, Sarah, who was also at the table, stood up. "Emily was a wonderful person. She would never have betrayed your father. I was with her through everything." My grandmother reached into the envelope again and pulled out another document. "This is the deed to the house. It was recorded in 1980, and it lists my husband and me as the owners. When my husband passed away, full ownership transferred to me. I never signed it over to your father or anyone else. Lisa's face went white. That's old paperwork. Your father has lived here for 20 years, she stammered. My aunt, the lawyer, said, living in a house doesn't mean you own it. The deed was never transferred. Grandma is the sole legal owner of this property. Jake was shocked. You're saying this house isn't Dad's? My grandmother said, this house is mine, and I will decide who stays in it. Lisa turned to my father. You're going to let your mother do this? My father didn't answer. He was still looking at the DNA report, realizing all the mistakes he'd made over the years. My grandmother turned to me. I had planned to leave this house to you in my will, but I don't think I should have to die for the right thing to happen. Lisa started crying, as she always did when things didn't go her way. I've given 20 years to this family. I cooked, I cleaned, and I raised you and Jake. And now you want to throw me out? Jake backed her up. Mom sacrificed everything for this family. But Sarah said, Lisa, I saw you slowly erase every trace of Emily from this house. You call that sacrifice? Lisa tried to turn the tables, but people were starting to see through her. One of the cousins asked about the developer. My aunt opened the folder and found a letter of intent from Evergreen Developments. Jake had signed it as the anticipated owner, but he had no legal claim to the house. My father finally spoke up. I didn't know about the developer, he said, his voice weak. Lisa turned on him. You knew. I told you Jake wanted to keep the house. My father said, you never said anything about selling. Jake tried to justify it as a business opportunity, but my father looked at him with disappointment. He then turned to me. I could see in his eyes that he realized how much he'd missed. I said, Dad, I'm your daughter. The DNA is right here. I never left. You pushed me out. He dropped his head in his hands. I didn't reach out to comfort him. I was done pretending that everything was okay. My grandmother then explained why she'd invited Sarah. Sarah told everyone that Lisa had started spreading rumors about my mother right after she moved in. She said that my mother used to disappear in the evenings, implying she was unfaithful. But in reality, my mother had been going to cancer treatments at night so she could be with me during the day. Lisa tried to say Sarah was being emotional, but everyone could see the truth. After that, the family dynamics changed. People started to see Lisa and Jake for who they really were. The social web that Lisa had built over 20 years started to fall apart. In the end, my grandmother transferred the ownership of the house to me. My father started to reach out, but I was still hesitant. I've learned that I don't need to explain myself anymore. The DNA, the deed, and the pencil marks on the doorframe are proof enough that I belong. I've started working on the house, bringing back the roses and hanging up the old pictures of my mother. Every spring, I plant new roses, just like she used to. And I make apple pie for every family gathering, using my mother's recipe that Sarah gave me. It's been a long journey, but I've finally found my place in this house and in my family. And I know that my mother is still with me, in every rose and in every mark on the doorframe.